I'm going to hit record and I'm going to say, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this today's webinar held by the Youth Disability Advocacy and Research Network. It is our first one of 2024, so I will say Happy New Year to all of you folks out there. And I'll also say I'm delighted to introduce two friends and colleagues, erstwhile colleagues in the case of Andrea. Andrea Medrado and Isabella Riga will be doing this webinar today. Andrea is a senior lecturer in the School of Media and Communication at the University of Westminster. She's a former Bournemouth University colleague too. She's the leader of the Cultural Identities and Social Change theme at the Camry Institute in Westminster, and also the course leader for the BA Digital Media Programme. And she's the current Vice President of IAMCR, which is the International Association for Media and Communication Research. She's joined by Isabella Riga, who's a Professor of Digital Media and Social Change at Bournemouth. And she's also the co-chair of the Working Group on Distance Education for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. She's led several research projects funded by research councils, and she's on the advisory board of the Journal of Media Literacy Education and various other networks too. Both are published widely in this field of advocacy and digital media and so on. And their recent, I think some of their talk today will be informed by their recently published book, Media, Activism, Artivism, and the Fight Against Marginalisation in the Global South. So with that, I will say, I'll hand over to Andrea and Isabella Riga and welcome you all to this webinar.
Hello. Sorry. Thank you so much, Dan, for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation, for having us here. Happy New Year, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, multi-time zone greetings. I'm Andrea Medrado, and we are going to organize our presentation in two halves. The first one is more about the idea of South to South as in Global South dialogue. And the second part is more on the issue of visibility. We are going to be talking about Kenya and Brazil, the countries that we've done research on. So I think, oh yes, so we should probably share our slides. I am joining you from my phone. I'm sorry, I had some slight technical problems joining the room, but hopefully you can hear me and see me and see our slides. So, okay. So can I just checking? You can hear me okay and see me? Yes? Okay. So we, our presentation, as I said, is on South to South. Sorry?
Do you see the full screen mode or you see?
Yes. Yes. Okay. So we're good to go. Yes, I am Andrea Medrado, and I am going to talk about the first part on South to South dialogues. And the issue of visibility, lessons from Kenya and Brazil is the title of our presentation. So you can change slide, Isa. So all this comes from a project called eVoices, Redressing Marginality, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. This was a project that I worked on with Isabella. She was the principal investigator. I was the co-investigator at the time. I was based in Brazil. But I had worked in Bournemouth, so it's kind of a long story. But basically, we came together to work on this project. And the idea was to investigate uses of digital technologies by marginalized groups in Brazil, in Kenya, different countries of the Global South. But the presentation today, we're going to focus specifically on Brazil and Kenya. And the idea of the network was to gather, academics, but of course also activists, practitioners, grassroots, civil society organizations to delve into these issues. So we worked on this project in 2018, 2019, seems like a long time ago, so much has happened. It all started with a meeting in Bournemouth in January, very, not maybe the best month to bring people to the UK, so quite cold. But we were discussing, so basically we brought together all the members of the partnerships. As I said, we had activists from Brazil, academics, from Kenya, but also from other countries like Costa Rica, the US, and we all got together and we started to discuss, in what ways can digital media can be used to fight marginalization from the perspectives of marginalized communities. And I came to this project building on a long time that I've been doing research with favela communities, so the shanty towns or slums, in Brazil, and specifically in Rio, where I was based. So we had this meeting, we kind of drew out some key themes about, in what ways can digital technologies fight marginalization. One of, we can give us literacies, but visibility has kind of two aspects to it, positive and negative. We'll come back to that later. Later in that year, in the same year, we had a meeting in Brazil, in Rio, in which the activists and the residents of favelas met with people from the organizations in Kenya that we were working with. And the organization that we were working mostly with was called POWER 254, Power for Power, the slang in Kenya for power, and 254 is the Kenyan code number. And they work with artivism, this idea of artivism. So everyone came together. We had a debate about this issue. But at the time in Brazil, we were very impacted, all of us, academics, residents, activists, by the murder of Marielle Franco, who was city councilor at the time, the only Black woman to be a city council, self-declared Black woman to be a city councilor in Rio. And she was a strong advocate for human rights and the rights of people from favela communities, the youth from favela communities, who are obviously, very, very frequently, unfortunately, victims of police brutality, police killings for being poor and Black. So this was all very kind of strong, and we were all very shaken by what happened to Marielle. So we decided that a few months later, we would do, when we went to Kenya, as part of the activities of the network, to do an animation to honor Marielle Franco, produced by Kenyan activists who were working with similar themes of, brutality, social inequality. So that's what happened. And then this kind of created an animation and also an exhibition, because the frames used to make the animation were part of an installation, artistic installation, also in the Museum of Maré. I forgot to mention that Maré is actually a favela, a shanty town in Rio, a very large shanty town. So this is probably one of the few museums in Brazil to be located kind of in the bordering areas of a favela or a shanty town. And it's also the favela from where Marielle was from. She was a Black woman, but she was also born and raised in a shanty town. So she was marginalized, from an intersectional perspective in many, many ways, like a Black woman coming from a shanty town, who in any case, managed to become a rising star in politics until she was killed, for her fight against police brutality. So yes, so in the end of the year, we had this event with the showing the screen, the frames that were used to make this animation. So the kind of project came full circle, in which we started in Brazil, we went to Kenya, we went back to Brazil. So really building these dialogues, between the participants. All this, generated this book that Isabella and I just published, called Media Activism, Artivism. So the combination of arts and activism and the fight against marginalization in the global South, South-to-South communication. I'll tell you in a moment what we mean by this idea of South, global South. So the book's just been published, we start setting a bit of the kind of contextual theme. What do we mean by marginalization? What do we mean by South? Then we have a chapter 2, specifically about favela media activism, so slum shantytown activism in the Brazilian context. Then the third chapter is about Kenya and artivism, the combination of arts and activism. The fourth chapter, we talk about a model that we developed with these ideas of visibility and the advantages and disadvantages of visibility, achieving visibility on social media, for example, for activists. On chapter 5, we talk about this experience of the animation that we're actually going to share with you here today as well. And chapter 6 is kind of a concluding chapter. And yes, I just wanted to say this book has been unfortunately priced a very high price that's basically like prohibitive, for example, for our collaborators in Brazil. It will be published in open access version in Portuguese later this year. But we are happy to share, the PDF. Just basically get in touch with us, and we'll share if anyone is interested. So yeah, Isa, next slide. Okay, so we were really interested in these narratives of the South, because across the so-called global South, for example, Africa, Latin America, Brazil, I come from a city that's like 88% Black, Salvador, and we only hear negative things about each other. It's always negative histories. It's always, negative information, a lot of ignorance about each other. So we were really interested in the moments of the narratives intertwine, when they're intertwined, they transform, they enriched. So what do we learn about each other in a different light, given the colonial legacies that we have of kind of negative information about each other across the global Souths in the plural. And we were working specifically with Africa and Latin America, Brazil and Kenya. And we had contacts in both countries. Both countries have a very active activist community online. Kenya is huge on former Twitter, X. Lots of influencers are very vocal about social issues, and the same apply to Brazil. Also, both countries, we have media representations of the poor that are very binary. It's either, the criminal person versus the good citizen, and the person who lives in the shanty town is always the criminal person. The city versus the non-city, which is the slum or the shanty town. So those binaries are very unhelpful, and they are very present in the media representations of both countries. So that's another element that we found in common. So the idea is to use, arts, animation, these activities that we promoted with the network to challenge these colonial hierarchies that devalue, all the knowledges that stem from the global South, all the histories, all the stories. When we did the animation workshops, in Kenya, we did an animation to honor Marielle Franco. I told you a little bit about her. In Brazil, as the film director, funded actually by a different source of funding, but in any case, she applied the kind of same activity, the same philosophy, and this time with Brazilian youths, they created an animation to honor Wangari Maathai. So again, a powerful female Kenyan figure. So that's how kind of the dialogue took place with arts. We were also interested in how these practices, these artivist practices, could be used for solidarity. Again, kind of challenging the lack of mutual knowledge that we have about each other across the global South. We were drawing from intersectional, decolonial perspectives to understand what's special, can we talk about a South to South type of media activism or artivism that's like unique? And it's really focused around memories and histories. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. What do we mean by the global South? I know there's a lot of debate about this term. Some people really like it, some people hate it. It's not, of course, a simple geographic location. Yes, like in a lot of the countries in Africa are in the southern hemisphere, and in South America the same, but it's much more than that. We are talking about oppression, inequality. We find it that it's a very useful and problematic term at the same time. Problematic because it kind of lumps together all the others. It's kind of when we come in through the immigration, the UK, rest of the world, the others, and that's not helpful. But at the same time, it conveys this idea of a political solidarity project across the global South. Obviously, we can find global South in the North and vice versa. For example, poverty, inequality, in a city like London, in cities of the so-called global North. And similarly, in Rio, you have extremely, wealthy areas in which the standards of living are not dissimilar from a global North country. But in any case, we think of this idea of the global South as a conversation starter to talk about issues of colonial heritage, legacies, colonial scarring, and healing. So we're going to talk now about the creative practices that we engage with during the project as a kind of seed for a movement building in the global South between the countries that I'm talking about, which are Brazil and Kenya. So the animation workshop that I was mentioning earlier was done in August in 2018. It was led, directed by Paula Kalos, who is also at Bournemouth University. She's an animation scholar, researcher, and practitioner. And Nyendo Muki, a Kenyan brilliant filmmaker, animator. So they gathered a group of young people, young artists, artivists in Kenya, during a workshop which lasted 4 days to honor Marielle Franco, as I said, a Brazilian politician, human rights activist. She was born in a favela shanty town, and at the time she was the only Black woman in the city council of Rio. And the way that this animation was done was that when Marielle was killed, we gathered, curated hundreds of images about Marielle when she was campaigning, but also the protests that erupted in Brazil when she was killed. These images were then printed in A4 or letter-sized piece of paper, as you can see in the image there. And the artists, they didn't necessarily have any background on animation, but they were all artists, either, photographers, or they did, fine arts, or they're all artists, but not necessarily, experienced with animation. And they were asked to manually intervene on these images, bringing something from them, like their own identities, into the image. But they also had to work together. So animation works as a sequence, and your image needs to be, in a way, a continuation of the image of the person next to you. So this created a collaborative practice between them. And before this process started, I actually traveled to Kenya and I did a presentation about Marielle, her life, what she meant, her fight for the marginalized. And so that was kind of the starting point where they all felt, kind of invested in Marielle's story to honor her legacy. And we did interviews with the artivists in both countries to kind of understand a little bit more about this process and how it happened. Next one is... Oh, yes. So why animation? So the participants, animation, as I said, enabled this kind of collective, collaborative practice, even if people were not experienced with animation. After they did the interventions on the images were all scanned. It was like hundreds and hundreds. So I don't envy the job of this person who did the scanning of the images. And then they were animated. And the participants were leaving a bit of their identity, a bit of their markings, So it really was a process of dialogue as well, of the identities of the Kenyans with the identities of the Brazilians, kind of connecting to each other during the workshop, the people who were participating, but also to the message, to Marielle Franco's story, and to the plot of the Brazilian activists and the fight of the Brazilian activists. They were able to bring a bit of their own identities, transforming them into something meaningful. For example, one of the participants was drawing a symbol of a sunflower, a woman, a single mom, a solo mom. And she was saying, no matter where you are, if you are in a favela in Rio, or if you are in Kibera, if you are a solo mom, you need to be always chasing the sun. So that symbol of the sunflower was meaningful, and could connect the realities of the Brazilians and the Kenyans. So the kind of intersectional identities as a kind of a binding element in a way. So next. Oh, yes. So now we will play for you the animation portrait of Marielle, which was made in Kenya to honor Marielle Franco. And then later, after that, we will play another animation, the one that was made about Wangari Maathai in Brazil, with Brazilian artists, directed by the same Kenyan filmmaker, Nyendo Muki, but she wasn't funded by the eVoices project for the second animation because the project had ended. But yes, so I will now be silent for a few minutes so that you can watch these two animations that Isabella will share with you.
Please let me know if that you hear the sound.
Okay. Yes.
Johnny, nina machozi machoni. Wow. History ni satiani. Masem chani tamu ya. Design na kuchekiani. Look within you, utapata unachosaka. Juma wingu ilifunga. na sai jua imechomoza design, ina prove it's a new day. Tuko fan na see, my eyes are red to ya machozi nilimwaga jana, but in a hope, so I can still see. Nataka ni spell hii jina na si jina tu, hii jina iko na C katikati, yani FRANCO, but most importantly MARIELLE, yani nabonga kuhusu Franco Marielle. Tulimpoteza Marielle akipigania haki za kina mama, mwanalahoi, wanyonge na walionyongwa na serikali. Kweli hii serikali ina serikali za kuiba maisha za watu. Hii serikali ina serikali za kuiba maisha za watu. Long live in our hearts. R.I.P. F. Marielle. R.I.P.
Mwanasiasa mtetezi wa haki ya kina dada na bado mzazi, alikuwa wakili wa watu maskini wanaoteswa na serikali katili. Wanatumia vikosi vya polisi kusimamishia watu maisha kwa risasi.
Okay, so now oh yeah, I have my microphone. You can play the second. There's a question, can someone describe for the blind?
So maybe just do a brief summary of what we just saw.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the animation was showing some images of Marielle and other Black women in Brazil dancing as in a celebration. Those images were taken from the campaign period of Marielle Franco when she was running for the city hall, but also some images of protests in Brazil edited. All of those were from frames that were animated. So you have these visuals of Black women dancing together with between them images of protests, large protests, people holding placards in Brazil protesting the killing of Marielle. I hope to have done justice to the visual description. Could someone add someone would like to add something to what I've said?
I thought that was a good summary.
Good summary. Okay, right. So now, so we have this idea. Oh no, let's play the Wangari Maathai then. So that was a similar technique in which images, but this time of Wangari Maathai, were printed, and the Brazilian artists in Salvador, Bahia, led by the same Kenyan filmmaker Nyendo Muki, did manual interventions on the images, then they were scanned and they made this film. I must also say that the song, the sound aspect is also very important. With the Marielle film, this was a song that Marielle liked called Edoshun, like talking about the Yoruba deity Oshun. And so they made a Kenyan version of that song, in Sheng, combining Swahili, English, with poetry as well. And the lyrics say, that we have tears, for what happened. We're grieving for Marielle, but we also have hope, so we can still see through the tears. There's a horizon of hope about the mobilization of people together. And with Wangari, yes, I won't talk about the song yet. So I'll let you see the animation. I'll do the visual description as well after Isabella plays the video.
Wangari, 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 Wangari. Seus olhos continuam vivos, espumando pelo mar da Bahia. O barco das memórias atravessou o oceano e fez da sua história a nossa história. Aprendemos a lidar com a terra, seguramos suas mãos negras, plantamos árvores e tudo tornou-se verde. Quênia, ressoa o nome Wangari, gritem revolução, mulher negra, desde o ventre da sua mãe. Wangari, seus olhos continuam vivos, espumando pelo mar da Bahia. O barco das memórias atravessou o oceano e fez da sua história a nossa história. É o andar de pés no chão que aprendi com minhas ancestrais. É o andar de pés no chão que aprendi com minhas ancestrais.
Thank you, Isa. Okay, so for this video, we have images of trees. They're very colorful. They have very colorful interventions upon the images. We start with trees, edited with images of Wangari Maathai at different points of her life, you know, younger and then as she grows older, with images of also laborers working the land, working the earth, with seeds, for example. There's images of women holding hands. We can see close-ups of hands with seeds. And then in the end, we have an image of Wangari receiving the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, and smiling, you know, with a very, very happy and broad, beautiful smile. So I hope, again, I did justice to the film. Thank you. In terms of the music, so this was people from Brazil, so they're using a Brazilian Afro beat with the agogô, which is a Brazilian Afro instrument, and also poetry. And the lyrics in Portuguese talk about Wangari and how her eyes are still alive, foaming on the ocean, you know, that connects Africa and Brazil. So moving on to, we have here this idea that the artivism was a tool to enable a South-to-South dialogue. So when we talked to people who participated in the workshops, in the animation workshops in both countries, in Kenya and Brazil, they would say that art was the starting point, you know. They were all interested in different art forms. So really art was what brought everybody together. So this kind of connecting power of art. And one of them, a Brazilian artist called Milena, she said, without the arts, you know, we couldn't learn the stories. Everything started with the art. We were really like the process of drawing, painting together, intervening on these images, really strengthened the sense of connection between the artists, but also in the Brazilian case, to Kenya, to Wangari, to the filmmaker, Nyendo. And the Brazilians were also always speaking about how little they knew. For example, they didn't know about Wangari Maathai, and they were so shocked. How could we not know about this wonderful woman who won, you know, a Nobel Prize? We don't know anything about the histories that stem from Africa, and the other way around. Next, Isa. So yes, so I was just mentioning, yes, we knew nothing about Wangari, and this is also about ancestry. So the Brazilians were really talking very strongly about this idea of ancestry, learning more about their ancestors, how this can move them, also learning about Nyendo, the filmmaker's work. And they were saying how powerful this experience was, you know. It was really cathartic in a way. And also in a sense of getting different references, plural references that stem from the South. We always learn about the stories, you know, of the British monarchy, about, you know, but we never learn anything about the African histories and these reference points, these examples of stories, of brilliant stories, stories of power. So this was something that they were very impressed about, and something that really moved them. Next. Also, this idea of honoring Black women, the Black women as the kind of narrative points, you know, and they both, Wangari and Marielle, were offering their conceptions of human rights and environmental justice from different perspectives. Of course, the contexts are very different, but in a way, this allows us to challenge that idea of the universal knowledge, you know, the knowledge that stems from just one dominant place in the world. On the opposite, what we have is what some of the scholars, in decolonial thinking called pluriversal approaches. A world with many worlds, and many worlds that are full of knowledge, full of wisdom. So we often have this idea that, the colonial past, the people from the colonies, they're not civilized enough. They're kind of frozen in the past. And so it's kind of interesting that the animation is actually about movement, about unfreezing this idea of being stuck in the past. On the opposite, the connections between Souths make things come to life, breathe, and inspire each other. And the connections between the Brazilians and the Kenyans show in the films, I think. So next. So also the idea that the stories were interconnected, and both, artists in Brazil and in Kenya were talking about how they cross each other all the time, whether we realize it or not. So during this exercise, they felt that they could build a kind of a new collective memory that's more positive and more constructive about each other. So we learned histories, they said, but we also made histories, and we could recognize ourselves in our stories and histories to become stronger. I mean, Brazilian women, for example, Brazilian Black women, they're so poorly represented on media. So it's so important that they could recognize themselves in these stories of power and inspiration that are stemming from plural Souths. Next, I am now concluding my part. I hope I didn't go over time, but this paying homage to Marielle and Wangari teaches us that the stories are connective and that the connections can be transformative. They allow this creation of collective memories, as I said, through dialogues, artivist dialogues. When the workshop finished, the participants were saying, well, we made something new, a newly created collective memory, as I just said. And also something that was mentioned very frequently is this idea of learning to unlearn negative information across the South and freeing ourselves from colonial mental loads. Now, of course, there are some really significant challenges in a project like that. I mean, language is the first one. Most of the Brazilians, of course, don't speak English, and so we were also asking ourselves, was this like just a passing, quick? Is it sustainable to do projects like this? And there are lots of challenges, financially, funding, culture. But in any case, we think that this idea of the South to South dialogue is a powerful one. It shows potential, it shows avenues, even if it's a humble start of a political solidarity project between Global South marginalized peoples. So thank you. I'm done with the first half, and I was just wondering, yes, do you have any questions or comments? Sorry, it's a little bit difficult for me to see the comments on my phone, but I'll try and catch up with the chat. Any questions or comments?
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, you left up 2 questions on the screen. That would be great if you could hold them up a little bit longer. Just if it prompted any questions or comments from our colleagues.
All right. Yes. Okay. So yes, I mean, we were just curious to hear your own experiences of people in the room. If they had experiences of arts, activism, dialogue. We're just curious to learn if there are similar experiences that could be shared in this virtual room. And also this idea of South to South dialogue, if there are experiences, challenges, how can we make this happen? So
Right.
just, yes.
We'll leave them up and give people a couple of moments. If you want to either put your hand up or put something in the chat. Or, oh no, I was going to say put the question in the chat, but that's probably going to take too long.
We can also come back to that later and have Isabella do her part on visibility.
Yeah, sure. I'll make note of those questions and put them in the chat.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Yeah, so the second part of this presentation focus more on the issue of visibility. As Andrea said, this was one of the main key elements that keep being discussed in all the meetings that we have during the eVoices project. And yes, so like when we talk about visibility and invisibility and marginalization, when we talk about marginalization, we talk about being groups of people that are involuntarily excluded from participating in normal sphere of life. So they are pushed and forced to the margins. And obviously, visibility and invisibility is associated with people who have been neglected, ignored, and rendered invisible. So if we don't see them, we don't need to care for them. And the activist and artivist group we were talking about were like really talking about how this was happening in their context, in the context of the favela, how the favela and the life in the favela is dehumanized and rendered invisible by mainstream media, by mainstream politics, and so on and so forth. And how their fight was about like tell a different story, challenge the mainstream representation of themselves, of the residents, for example. And obviously, one of the way that both artivists in Kenya and media activists in Brazil were using to get visible, to be recognized, to exit from this real or invisibility is using social media. And using social media give, you know, like the possibility to these groups to be seen and exposed and break the state's power of silencing people. But, and this was, as I said, very prominent and relevant from the beginning, while visibility brings recognition, so it brings the possibility to be seen, and so it has an empowering value attached to it, and with it social media that allow visibility. Visibility is also a very dangerous thing, because with visibility comes the possibility to be visible, be watched, be monitored, and be surveilled. And so then with visibility comes the possibility to be threatened. And that's why our participants, the groups of activists we work with, define visibility as a double-edged sword. As in the word of some media activists in Brazil, visibility is essential. We have to deal with the corporate media, and they create distorted realities. This form of manipulation might even turn the population against the social movement and their agendas. So visibility is key to clarify what are the true agendas of social movements and to generate a debate about such dynamics contrasting the dominant views. But to become visible is to become vulnerable. We keep questioning ourselves. Do we need to grow this much? Do we need that much visibility? We really don't know what the balance is. And this was just after the murder of Marielle Franco, that how Andrea said was a very critical moment for the media activists in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. So based on what we were gathering and understanding from the activist groups we were working with in the project, and based on the work that Andrea had done before, digital ethnographic work that Andrea had done before in Rio de Janeiro, and the ethnographic work we did during the project, what we wanted to understand was what happened when activists from marginalized background achieve visibility. So And this is how the stepping into visibility model was born, tracing the journeys that the activists we were working with described to us. So we try to identify different steps into the visibility journeys of these activists. And what I want to say here is that, we wanted to understand visibility as a path with different milestones. We don't want to, then there is a, visual representation of it, but this, it's not as linear as is in the graph. We don't understand it as linear as it in the graph. And we want to stress the fact that, there are context-specific variation to visibility levels across time that depends on the different histories and unique characteristics of each activist group. But what we found was that into their visibility journey and negotiating, the pros and cons, the potential benefits and threats that visibility bring with it, we saw that the activist groups we were working with in Brazil and Kenya, started with going visible or increasing the invisibility. And when they were reaching this visibility, that is obviously one of the goals of activists and social movement, right? To have their cause heard, beyond the like outside their normal reach. They often hit a critical visibility moment. So a moment in which visibility turns from positive to negative. So a moment in which visibility becomes a threat. And usually this happens when visibility has a peak, and then activists become at risk and in a vulnerable place. And they become victims of serious attacks and repression by authorities, both in the online domain and in the real life. And so what we started to see is how activists manage this visibility moment. So if they are able to, put in place strategies that help us overcome this moment, and what these strategies are, or if they succumb to the critical visibility moment. Actually, again, I'm saying succumbing to the critical moment, but actually, it could be also a strategy to decide to, for example, not growing further, not going more visible, but go behind the scene for a moment, for quite a time, to regain strength, reflect on their strategies, and absorb the risk that they have faced. So I hope that you can imagine the dynamics, although the graph is it's fixed. So what I wanted to do now is to try to map the visibility journey of two activists we have worked with. One is Maré Vive. Maré Vive is a collective fighting against police brutality in favelas. And so what we want to do is to trace the visibility journey using the step into visibility moment, looking at what are the strategies and how, what were their critical visibility moment, and what are the strategies that I put in place to be able to work on them. As I said, Maré Vive is a collective, a group of activists that operates mainly through their Facebook page. And this Facebook page started, by covering the military occupation that were happening in Rio de Janeiro, in the favelas, and the military operation that were happening there under the scheme of pacification of favelas. And this page became like quite popular and attract a lot of attention. Like their Facebook page reached a great number of followers, and this was becoming, you know, like something that a page that residents were using, for example, to check what like before going to work or before going to school, to understand which were the safe space, if the streets were safe, it was safe to go out and, you know, like undertake their daily life. And they were, you know, posting, as I said, about police brutality in the favelas from a favela perspective, and this attract attention within their community, so within Maré, but also attention from other favelas and that other part of the city. And this is when the activists, Maré Vive, faced one critical visibility moment. Suddenly, activists discovered that there was another page, a fake page, Facebook page, that like claimed to be of the same collective of Maré Vive, that were posting, you know, picture of alleged drug dealer and like exposing faces, and when they received that, they start receiving life threats, and people were in the favela residents, when they were starting, you know, like losing trust and losing followers. So that was the critical visibility moment. So they were becoming too visible and too and therefore also being surveilled. So the question now is how they manage this moment. They contacted some reporters from a TV record, and one of the program, you know, well-known program of this TV station, Balanço Geral, ran a story to clarify the confusion about the fake page. So ran a story to clarify that Maré Vive Collective was not, you know, the owner of the fake page. And soon after this program was screened, yes, on air, went on air, the fake page was deleted, and they received a standard inbox message with an apology. So this is how, so reaching to mainstream media was the way in which, and so probably going even more visible, was the way in which Maré Vive was able to overcome this critical moment. I wanted to say only another thing about the examples that we are presenting here. They are example about in which the critical visibility moment is external, and we are reflecting about the groups and the activists manage it. Sometimes, and we have seen that critical visibility moments happen because visibility is not like, doesn't bring an external threat, but brings also, you know, internal debates within the activist groups. But we haven't tackled this when talking and reflecting about visibility journeys. But I think it's an important element for future research and reflections. The second, okay, I see a lot going on in the chat. I'm not able to look at the chat. Dan or Andrea, tell me in case I have to stop and there is something that we need to discuss also now.
Yeah, okay, so yeah, so there's a question from Dan on if there are experiences of similar critical visibility moments where you achieved visibility, but then also felt vulnerable to those who were challenging in your advocacy work. So then we have a comment that in the context of persons with disabilities, visibility is a plus, and in my experience, it made me achieve more than operating in an unseen position. Then there's another comment about Uganda. It is political activism that would endanger you. Would campaigning for disability rights be considered political activism in Uganda? Dan asked this question to Banya. And then we had disability activists who experienced critical visibility and brought down through politics. And then another comment on disability rights is not about politics in Uganda, but rights such as gay is what would land you into trouble because of laws.
Thank you, Andrea. So if you agree, I think this is very, very interesting. So how the political aspect of activism is a key for visibility becoming a threat. Yes, like as we said, is a double-edged sword. So absolutely, visibility is, you know, a goal and is beneficial. But like this is the question that like we would like to discuss with you later, and you are, you know, bringing in the comments. But what happened? Is it in your case? Is it in your activist work becoming also a threat? And if so, what are the strategies that one group could put in place to overcome this threat? So thank you very much. This is very interesting, and obviously the cases that we are looking at are not focusing on disability. Yes, and I think if we talk about LGBT community, this yes, like we see again, you know, this intertwine between the cause and the political element attached to it, and how visibility can become a threat. But that's very, very interesting. So let me just go on with the second and explain the second case, and then I hope we can have a discussion about that. So the second case is about Nairobi Noir and Mzingi Sassis. As Andrea mentioned, we work with artivists in Kenya, artivists linked to a hub, a creative hub, Power 254, that is also you know, an activist group, an activist collective. So Power you know, gather artivists that use their arts to talk about social issues, political issues in the city of Nairobi and in general in Kenya. One of the artists affiliated with Power 254 is Mzingi Sassi, who used photography and photography with a noir aesthetic to unpack social issues related to marginality in the streets of Nairobi. So what Mzingi does is going around the streets of Nairobi and you know, taking picture of you know, homeless people, deprived communities, to prostitutions, to denounce the social inequalities inside the city of Nairobi. So Mzingi started working on this kind of picture and started posting them on social media, and that like immediately increasing its visibility, and Power 254 got in touch with him to ask him if he could join the collective. He founded Nairobi Noir. He was invited to you know, festivals to share its works, and so on and so forth. So his work became popular. Maybe like what I have to say is that Power 254 is was funded by Boniface, a photojournalist that was documented the violence happening in the aftermath of the election in Kenya, and so is a very prominent figure in Kenya. And Power is a prominent hub of activist hub in Kenya. And so it's also a very surveilled hub of activists in Kenya. So very visible itself, the hub, Power 254. So one night he was, as always, going around the streets of Nairobi, taking pictures, and it was near a mall. It was after one of a very big terrorist attack in a mall, in a very big mall in Nairobi happened that shook the city. So like some people started seeing him taking picture. Like he got like they're starting questioning why he was taking picture, thinking he was a terrorist, and so like he was almost lynched by the mob, by the crowd. The police intervened, and he got arrested. But he got arrested as a terror suspect. The fact that it was linked to Power was probably known. And in the aftermath of this very big terrorist attack in the mall, there was a new law that made possible for the police to detain a terrorist suspect for something like 1 year time without disclosing that they were arrested. But Mizingi was part, and this is the critical visibility moment, right? But Mizingi was part of Power 254. And so they got to know that he was in prison. And Power started a big campaign, online campaign, to ask for his liberation. And at the end, after 2 or 3 days, Mizingi was released from prison. This critical visibility moment increased actually the Mizingi visibility. So it continued working in his studio and Nairobi Noir, but the news that he was arrested as a terror suspect was also shared online. And so his visibility and this reputation in this case was turning against him. So because of the spreading of the news that he was arrested as a terrorist suspect spread online, he started losing clients in his studio, and he couldn't pay his rent anymore, and eventually he became homeless in Nairobi. So he became part of the homeless community of Nairobi. And again, Power and its member, and because of the strength of Power, started looking for him, and he bumped into some of the member of Power 254 on the street, and they helped him to promote his art through the social media, through Facebook, and this helping sold his art, and overcoming the critical moment, and got back on his feet, and renting a new studio and starting working again as a photographer. So that's the other case, and you can see, I do think that these two cases shows different strategies, but also shows that, yeah, it's not it's really a journey. It's something it develops. There are different strategies, different moments, and different paths that visibility journeys could take for activists. So as concluding thought, Yes, so one of the things that we have noticed, and these are the two cases, if you look at the book, there are other cases shared there. The story of Power 254 itself, and Boniface is founder, and the story of Renata Souza in Brazil, an activist and a politician in Rio de Janeiro. You see that in one article, Andrea, called Link Visibility, is one of the things that, one of the strategy that he's used, or pool of strategy that is used by activists to face the threats that might be posed by visibility. So having strong network of solidarities with organization, influencer, other activist collective, and a very marked social media presence is what we have seen so far as one of the strategies that support activists when they hit a visibility crisis. And yes, and the other thing that we have seen is that like reflecting on this critical visibility moment is a way also to reflect on the strategy, the identity, and the message that the activist wants to convey and share. And when we were thinking about this idea of visibility journey and critical visibility moments and devising this imperfect model, the idea was that this could be a tool that activists could use to reflect in advance about what visibility could bring, and also to reflect in advance of what kind of strategy they could set in place or have in place when they or if a critical visibility moment happens. So we wanted to create or to think to create a tool that could be used also, to shape communication strategies of activists in advance before hitting the critical visibility moment. So yeah, the questions or the comments in the chat are exactly what we wanted to discuss with you at this point. So like first, if this, resonate or doesn't resonate with your experience as a researcher and activist, and in case, in case you have hit any visibility critical moment, or have faced the dual roles of visibility, what strategy you had in place to help you overcome this kind of critical moments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Isa.
Thanks both for a wonderful overview of this really interesting, excuse me, and important work. I've got questions that we were starting in the chat, but I'd really be happy to pass over to anyone if they wanted to ask any questions or offer any reflections.
The audio that was muted.
Hi, this is Banya.
Hi, Banya. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I would like to thank Andrea and Isabella for your wonderful presentations. And the issue of visibility, mostly in the global south, the issues mostly that endanger activists and advocates, mostly it's about politics, mostly it's about those issues that the law enforcers, mostly the authorities, the government don't want to do for the public. For example, if a government doesn't want to construct good roads for the public, and then activists come in and then rally the people, and then that becomes dangerous if people are advocating for such infrastructure, good water access to, and the government doesn't want to. So, or the fight against corruption, or the fight against bad leadership, and the government doesn't want to listen to the people. Such kind of issues always bring dangers to those that are advocating for such issues. And then a little bit about disability. I think visibility for disability advocacy has always been a plus, because mostly in the global south, again, persons with disabilities are not in the public domain, and therefore when they become visible, that's when their issues, that's when they gain empathy. That's when the people get to understand them, because most of them live behind doors, and therefore activism and visibility is a plus for persons with disabilities. But therefore, the other social issues, then the strategy should come around how do you do it with minimal visibility, but then the issues become visible where the activists don't become visible. I think that's what needs to be done. The strategy needs to focus on keeping safe the activists, but also the issues come up. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bani. I think this perspective is really important, of thinking from the perspective of the activism for persons with disabilities, how visibility is, there isn't really a double-edged sword, or at least not, and I think I agree with you completely on from the perspective of the Global South, just because the issues are so utterly invisible and the exclusions are so often, and it's so little talked about, and how ableism is just so widespread about everything. We just had an example now in the webinar how we didn't take into account persons with disability as well as we should have. So I agree completely that from that perspective, I think visibility is much more an advantage, and the starting point even, where things really have to start with really fighting for visibility, than the double-edged sword that we are talking about in the presentation. So thank you so much for bringing this into the perspective. Yeah, Isa, would you like to add something?
Yeah, Banya, thank you very much. And I want to stress it even again, yes, visibility is essential for activists, and what you're mentioning is absolutely right. But yes, I wanted to say what Dan is saying. It's not my field, but I am thinking when if we talk about rights for people with disability, this touches politics, right? This touches government, this touches policies, and ask for reforms, for change. This is where I see visibility could become, a threat as well. For the little I know about, yes, the issue of disability and activism, I do agree with you. Visibility is the first step. We have to become visible, but I do see the danger when visibility gives the activist group the power to start challenging the status quo. I think this is happening, and the status quo is policy and politics and government, but it's a question mark.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Banya, for that question too. Did anybody else have any other comments or questions? Paul, did you want to elaborate on your question? I wonder what you mean by, what you mean by the challenge. Do you think you could tell us a bit more, your thoughts?
Yes. Thank you very much, and Happy New Year. Sorry that I joined late because of a challenge of entering. Like Banya has mentioned, for us who focus on disability, we highly appreciate art and film in making disability issues visible and advocating for disability inclusion across all sectors and programs, say in government and civil society. The challenge though is, how do we use art and film? Because one is a technique. 3, it is a skill that few people have. Not everybody can use film, can use art to portray a message unless you have a skill in that area. That is why it becomes a challenge. So sometimes when we use the media also has got its own interest. Now to focus the media, because those are the people who have got some skill in film, some skill in communicating, some skill in using art to present a message. Sometimes they become expensive. And yet you who wants to portray the message, you may not have the same, the resources that they require, but still you require them to develop for you the message. So actually, the presentation that has been done this afternoon, I can appreciate the summary, how art brings out issues clearly. But you will also appreciate how long the people who have presented the message, how long they have taken to present that, the time they have used, the resources, and so forth. But at the end of the day, you see that a very small picture can portray thousands of messages about an issue. So that is my challenge around art and film, but I highly appreciate it. The challenge though is the skill and the resources to portray the message. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Yes, thank you, Paul. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's a great challenge you presented here. I think I started to touch upon this in the conclusion, but we spoke in a rushed way about that, and also the meaning of, you know, grassroots, and then I think someone mentioned you. Let me go back to the chat. Power has funding and experienced people. Absolutely. Yes, I mean, the groups that we worked in Brazil as well, we worked with different groups, some that had more funding, more structure, and others that didn't have as much funding. Also, the issue that the people who are working are all volunteers. So all of that also involves quite a lot of time, commitment, and investment, in which, for example, one of the groups we're working with, the issue that they had is that there were people, you know, who were actually getting trained in this media activist initiative. They were learning the media skills that are so expensive and so time consuming and require, you know, support. When they start picking up on those skills and becoming good, for example, making the videos and the artistic languages that are necessary for this activism, then they get a job, they need to leave, they need to do something else, they need to make a living. So absolutely, I think these structural elements of, you know, funding, support, the skill. Of course, also this film, I think it's something that sometimes we say and sometimes we forget, was led, of course, by a very experienced filmmaker, Nyendo. And I think that was a really key part of why these films worked so well, you know, in the connections. And we were able to count on that structure of having this filmmaker do this. So yes, so thanks for the reality check, Paul, and bringing that to the table, because absolutely, I think the structural issues are very, very important. Am I forgetting something, Isa?
No, I think I totally agree. Like, power is, as you mentioned, you know, like a very structured and prominent hub, and is made of artists, right? So is artists, like, this is another thing we don't have now time, but like, it's artists or activists. So it's activists that they become artists, or artists that become activists. And yeah, so for power, the artistic element was always, you know, part of their work. But yes, as you were saying, Paul, like this effect, the moving element, and like the immediate way in which an artistic, in our case, animation, could link together places that are so far, but they have so many points of contacts when we talk about, context, marginalization, and oppression, was really something that I think it was something I learned through the project. And one thing that I wanted to say, like without undermining what you said, because yes, it's a lot of work of practice of funding. What I wanted to say is that this animation, that the portrait of Marielle, as Andrea said, traveled back to Brazil and was hosted, exhibited in the Museo da Maré, that is the museum that talk about the history of the favela in Maré. And then the thing that happened is that it's traveling on its own. So like we found out like last summer that the animation, so the Museo da Repubblica in Rio de Janeiro, a very big museum in the center of the city, had an exhibition about Marielle, and they contacted Museo da Maré, and Museo da Maré gave the animation to Museo da Repubblica to be part of the exhibition, of this big exhibition about Marielle. And I think that when we talk about output, like now I'm thinking about like as a researcher, right, and an academics, I think that this element of outputs that are artistics, that travels by themselves beyond the end of the project, is really fascinating because of the public and the audience they are able to touch, without us being involved anymore, right? Like, and so like, and they continue, what I want to say is that this dialogue is continuing through the animation itself, through the artifact itself.
All right, we got one more question, if that's all right, Isa. And Andrea, we've got time for one more question. We've got Blaise with his hand up. Well, it may be the real Blaise Murphet. It may not be, because a few people came on with his link. But whoever's got their hand up, I'm handing over to you.
Good afternoon.
Of course.
Yes. Yeah, lovely. Andrea and Isabel. I'm Rose. I'm coming from AHRC International. I was very excited to hear all the good work that you have been doing, specifically the art, the filming, but also the animation, which is kind of like innovation of its own. But what it excites me is all about being able to, also have voices and keep the voice, so it kind of protect the visibility and the things that we were worrying about, because within the disability sector, it's really key for them to be protected, because we have seen a lot of issues around them being visible. If we talk about person with albinism here in Tanzania, people are, get killed and so many other things. But also there have been a lot of power imbalances. So even when other people are trying as well to shine out and, gaining the power, somehow politically it's not positively being taken around the sector. So because politically there are those who have got power, they can be elected to become minister, they can be elected to become higher posts. So people, they will tend to say, why is this person coming up? And some of them have been really trying to be pulled down because of that particular visibility. But again, looking at the group themselves, do they know better how to create the good content and the good visibility, unless they are supported? But nowadays, that social media, Instagram, Facebook, all these creating, it's a content creating mechanism where they could take them and they could shine. But again, who is there to give them the right knowledge on how to do it and how to self while they're doing all this? And sometimes other people or other NGO, CSO are also taking the advantage and taking some scenarios, some stories. But again, I think there is also a huge need for the expertise on the filming as well as on art in terms of how this and the protection mechanism, how should it be done? So it's a collaboration such as what we are trying to do with BU University, where they brought also that kind of technicality, but also we bring the aspect of the vulnerability. And we try to explain locally in terms of cultural aspect. This is, yes, this is somehow probably we need to look at it in a different way. And also we try as well to work with the persons with disability themselves to understand and analyze and unpack all the risky aspects so that wherever we come up with the content like video, film, it has already captured all the aspects. But again, like what you have said, I agree with you, it is costly. Sometimes we are failing to go to those rural areas. We have also, there are a lot of kind of permission, as well as some of the issues. If you want to do the filming, it's really costly, and you need to plan it well so that you get all the permit to do what you wanted to do. So I'll just end there, but I really appreciate the discussion. It's quite exciting. So thank you also for the links. I think it's amazing work. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Rose.
Thank you so much, Rose. Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I think it's been one of the conversations in the chat about, well, basically the aim of our project was to have these conversations and exchange these experiences between these different groups in different settings. The majority of the groups we worked with were more in an urban setting, I must say. So a lot of the, I think also the resource, they were, I wouldn't say they were all fairly well resourced, but some weren't. But I mean, there were some formulas that they were using, I think. For example, the issue of reputation attacks. That was a frequent visibility critical thing to happen. If there's a group that's attracting attention, they're gaining visibility, they're getting the message out, then the leader or someone or the group itself would be attacked with, reputation destruction, fake news, fake images, and things like that. The way they would defend themselves, also because they have networks offline, these things are not disconnected. They were connected. The groups amongst themselves would be in a way to link with each other. So they would use people who are influencers or very vocal, sometimes even celebrities in the Brazilian mediascape, in the case of Brazil, to defend them and to then, tell another story. So it was really like these battles, these visibility battles were happening a lot. But since we did this research to today, I think already so much has changed in just a couple of years. Like the issue now of shadow banning that's happening, with that, they're just literally, no one sees them anymore. So I think there's another big issue of regulation, of holding the big tech accountable for coming up with ways to protect these groups. They talk so much about minoritized groups, but what is in place, to really protect these groups? And I'm recently now just started a project on the information security side of things, which is really interesting. So I hope to have some news for you soon. But it's basically, we are now working with cryptographers, people who are specialized in information security, and how they can learn on the ground from ethnographic, anthropological research with marginalized groups on how they can be protected from a kind of information security point of view. I think that's also very important. And it's a direction that we are heading, but it's very, very challenging scenario. Thank you so much, Rose, for thanks everyone for your questions. Yeah, I'll shut up.
Yeah. Oh, I'm really excited about your new, your next project. Yeah, please come back. Tell us all about it. Right. Isa, did you have any other final reflections? Otherwise, I'll briefly wrap up.
No, I just want to thank you all. It was really a very interesting discussion. Thank you for hosting. And yeah, hope to see you all again.
All right, listen, thank you so much, Isa. Thank you so much, Andrea, and to all of those of you who came along today and who contributed. We hope you found it useful. I'll just put a quick note in the chat about our next event, which you're very welcome to come along. That is by a colleague at Liverpool Hope University, Ella Houston, who's talking about advertising and disability activism. So that is in about 3 weeks' time. I hope to see you then. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.